We all have that one item. That one item that we just don't get along with. Whether it be that it's just bad and we've never been able to get any value out of it, or that it's just an item that we don't understand. Everyone has that one item that they just hate. Regular viewers of the channel will know that my personal enemy is the Old War Stealth Kit, as I've really never been able to get any decent use out of it, and because of that, I just hate it. Also, it's not a great item. Anyways, I asked you all for your personal nemeses, and on top of that, how you would rework the items to be better. If you enjoy this video, you should definitely subscribe. I talked to the popular kids, and they all agreed that you can sit with them at lunch if you subscribe to Socks Needs Help, as it is the coolest thing you can do. Without further ado though, let's get into your reworks and see if they belong in the Shrine of Rebirth or a scrapper. Of the 20 submissions I chose for this video, one of them had to be quote-unquote the worst. Before I show which submission it is though, I do want to clarify that none of these item reworks are bad necessarily, but instead that this ranking is more about my personal opinions on the reworks themselves. Every rework is valid, and there's no arguing that. Things like how realistic of a change they are, how balanced the reworks are, and how far from the original item it ends up being will all be taken into account for these rankings. I personally believe that the best item reworks should keep at least the original intentions of the original item, as if not, you're just kind of inventing a new item altogether, which defeats the purpose of making a rework. Most of the lower ranked item reworks in this video fall to this issue in particular, changing just a bit too much for my liking. Anyways, our 20th spot goes to the spare drone parts rework by Wolfpuck. Their personal issue with this legendary item is pretty silly, as it is truly and entirely personal. Their issue is that the drones are apparently hard to find, and that the item isn't easy enough to use. Without dwelling on that too much, their proposed changes are as such: turning 10% of the credits into drone credits, and making the drones on the ground glow to make them more obvious. On top of all of that, they want for additional stacks of this item to give you an additional Colonel Drone Man, on top of giving all of your existing drones an item. This is ridiculous, but also endearing. Spare drone parts is already one of the strongest legendary items, making drones genuinely viable and creating one of the strongest item combos in the game with empathy cores. Making more credits go to drones is fine, I suppose, but it would honestly be a bit of a downside, as less of the interactables that would spawn would be items, and you can only get so many drones at once. Getting an additional Colonel Drone Man is excessive, however cute, and a change that I honestly welcome, but I know is still too strong. Drone Man isn't overpowered or anything, but getting more of them compounding with the drone buffs would get out of hand fast. On top of all of this, as if the previous bit wasn't enough, they gain items as well, which is insane. Even if it were one tri-tip dagger, your drones would tack fast enough that any proccable items would become busted fast. I don't want to be too harsh on this item, as it's a fine one, and is clearly just a personal grievance, but it is overpowered, so for that, it's going to the bottom of the list. Next up, we have an item that truly exemplifies my problem from earlier, with a rework that completely changes the item, rather than reworking it. Okapi Farms proposes an idea to change the Knockback Fin, which is in need of a rework. However, their rework doesn't keep the original value of the Knockback Fin. Their change is pretty simple. Instead of giving you knockback on the enemies, it gives you a 10% chance to reflect a projectile back to the enemy, dealing 50% more damage if it hits. This is a very interesting item, however, it isn't a Knockback Fin anymore, more of a Reflect Fin. Knockback isn't the best effect in the game, sure, but it's still silly and fun to have, and can be done well with buffs. Completely removing that is something I just don't agree with, so I don't love the change. I do think this item is pretty interesting and worth exploring though. Reflecting projectiles is something we don't have, and is really cool. I'm imagining creating an impenetrable fort with engineer's turrets that just makes everything bounce off once you get a bunch of stacks of it. It's a really fun idea, but not really a rework anymore, so 19th it is. The next one is just a case of a number being a bit too high. Lindsay Hawks proposes a change for the Topaz Brooch because, in their words, the small amount of barrier given falls off towards the end of the game as you get more and more HP. This is a fine reasoning for the item, and I totally agree. However, it is the specific change they propose that is the issue. The new stats are as such, giving you a whopping 45 barrier, plus an additional 2% of your maximum health as barrier on top of that. On top of it all, they also include that your barrier wouldn't decay for 3 seconds after it procced on kill. This change is fine, However, tripling the barrier amount and giving it percentage barrier as well is too much. And with this item, you would have far too much barrier far too quickly. I think the additional 2% barrier is more than enough, so changing the base amount as well is just unnecessary. The third change of the delayed barrier decay is pretty great though, and one we'll touch on later with another rework, and if that were another item, I'd love to see that. Another thing I think a lot of people forget when making concepts is how they affect the use of other items. Especially with void items, I find that people often forget that they are not supposed to be direct upgrades, and instead supposed to be alternatives to the main item. Unfortunately, that seems to be what happens often, and is what happened with our next rework. Jan offers an idea for the Lost Seer's lenses that instead gets rid of the chance to instantly kill an enemy and replaces it with a quote void crit that deals 2.5 times damage instead of a normal crit's 2 times, but instead deals the additional damage 2 seconds after you deal a crit. I'm confused here though. I think I'm missing something, but isn't this just a direct upgrade of the crit glasses? Yeah, it deals more damage a little later, but I feel like this wouldn't matter, especially if the second hit had a proc coefficient. Some may argue that the Polyloot is a direct upgrade, but I don't think it's that simple. Sometimes people want to spread out their procs with the ukulele, even if the Polyloot has more value. I do agree with their reasoning for this rework though. The Lost Seer's lenses effect is incredibly niche, and while satisfying, the number is still too small to really make a difference in your run. I think there is potential here, but I don't think this is the way to go about it. I think our third cornerstone of what makes a bad item rework is finally here, and it's making an item just too complicated. Complicated items are not inherently bad, but there is definitely a limit to how bad it can be. Now, try to stick with me as I read through this concept for a rework to the Lepton Daisy because it took me a while to understand myself. In the teleporter zone, Lepton Daisies periodically bloom. These slow enemies down and provide a small healing burst, about the size of the Interstellar Desk Plant's AoE, giving you 10% HP, assumedly per second, as healing. If you shoot it, which kills the flower, 3 flowers in total bloom throughout the first half and second half of the teleporter fight. Multiple stacks allow for more daisies to bloom. 2 stacks makes 3 bloom for each third of the teleporter event, 3 for every quarter. For a simpler explanation that they leave, Lepton Daisies are periodically blooming during the teleporter event within the zone. These have an AoE slowing effect and healing effect that is slightly smaller than the Interstellar Desk Plants. I don't know if that simpler explanation really helps, because it doesn't include the part about how you're able to kill the daisies at all. But anyways, this is a lot. And I know that their reasoning for the change they talk about is how it doesn't have much personality or metagame potential, but I don't agree at all. I've recently gotten back on the Eclipse grind, and while the Lepton Daisy isn't great, timing your kiting into the TP zone to get healing when you really need it is a lot of fun. There are also like 3 teleporter related items, so I think that that's a lot of personality already. This new change of the periodically spawning plants is an interesting idea, however I don't see how it actually changes the Lepton Daisy for the better, as it really just makes it harder to use. I like the slowing aspect, but that's really all it has to offer over the original, and I don't think the item is really stronger this way at all. If anything, it's just more confusing. The next item rework is one that I believe is the first item on this list that I genuinely like. However, it's still pretty low for one major reason. Remember when I talked about how an item rework shouldn't make another item completely useless? Well, that kind of happens here. This item rework from PezPests is for the Hunter's Harpoon and replaces the speed boost on kill for a small slow on enemies on kill. It's a bit complicated, but I like it, attaching 2 hooks to nearby enemies on kill to slow them down for 40%. Now, I like it, and you might like it, and there aren't any issues with it, but isn't there someone you forgot to ask? That's right, this is kind of just a chronobobble with extra steps and a slightly weaker effect. And because of that, there isn't much reason to use it. The chronobobble isn't an amazing item, but its value on Eclipse 4 and its synergy with the Deathmark is nothing to be scoffed at. So yeah, I think another slowing item is a possibility, but I don't think this is the way to go about it. The Berserker's Pauldron is an item that I have a strange relationship with. I like it, and it's definitely not a bad item, but sometimes the effect comes after you actually need it. This rework is one that I honestly really like, and is really only lower on the list because I like the ones above it much more. This changes from this guy, and is to rework it from a big boost after a bunch of enemy kills to a small boost on every kill. I really like this idea, as it would slowly increase the boost over time, though I think it should have a bit of a limit, like Predatory Instincts has, to make it not ridiculously overpowered in the late game. I'm honestly not going to dwell on the reworks that I like that much, because there really isn't that much to say. I like the item, and I think it could be implemented as a change, and that's about it. This next rework is for the Longstanding Solitude, and is pretty great. The biggest issue with the item is that it makes the lives of your friends in multiplayer much harder, as it doubles the price of everything for everyone, not just the person holding it. Also, once you get to higher levels, you start losing the ability to buy anything, as leveling becomes very slow. All this rework does is, instead of converting your gold to XP, it simply increases your XP gain by 50% in exchange for only allowing you to buy 5 chests per stage. I like this a lot, and it doesn't affect your teammates anymore, and that downside isn't that detrimental. Effectively 5 items a stage isn't that bad, and that's about as many items as you get anyways, and it effectively saves you time as well. This is an item that I could really get behind, especially if there were some sort of interaction with the executive card, allowing you to purchase 1 more chest if you had it active or something like that. The Luminous Shot is an item that I don't hate the idea of, but is one that is just executed a bit poorly. It doesn't really do that much damage, and it's overall just underwhelming. This rework idea from JT changes it to, in their words, work more as a melee version of the shuriken. What it does is deal 600% damage to enemies near you per stack of the item's buff you get by using your secondary. This helps out most characters as a more defensive item that can also be metagamed into an offensive one. The damage is a bit much, but it's salvageable. Maybe starting at 300% would be a little bit more balanced. This way, it's a lot easier to get value out of and to metagame, as you wouldn't be essentially forced to lose your stacks like you do now. I like this change a lot, and I'd love to see it added. If anything, this could be an ability on a future survivor, acting like a safeguard for enemies that get near you. The Queen's Gland is a fun item, and getting a Beetleguard ally is fun. However, the ally you get isn't that strong. For those of you who don't know, the Beetle Queen has a unique debuff called Beetlejuice that reduces your movement speed, attack speed, and damage by 5% each. This is a pretty interesting effect, and one that I feel goes underused. Yokai offers a change for this item that simply gives you a chance to apply Beetlejuice onto an enemy. On top of this, you still keep your Beetleguard friend, and that Beetleguard now applies Beetlejuice on every hit. This wouldn't make the item that much stronger, as the debuff isn't that strong, but it would at least give it some more active use over just another ally. How about a double feature for this next one? The Deathmark and the New Growth Nectar items are pretty strong, however getting them to activate is a bit of a chore. This rework is less of a direct change and more of a vague concept for how to make these items a bit more fun and less punishing to use. Putting it simply, all this rework does is make it so that instead of getting a big buff from a lot of effects, you get a smaller buff from each individual effect. The numbers used here might need a bit of tuning, but I think that what matters is a basic concept itself, and I do feel like this would genuinely be fun to have, at least more fun than the current items. Any reason to get more consistent value out of this item is a great one for me. The Preon Accumulator is an item that I really want to like, however the 2-minute cooldown is really punishing for the effect, which, while strong, is inconsistent and a bit lame after a while. It's a bit fire and forget right now, so I think that the rework idea here helps it out a lot. Bandit suggests a change that I like a lot. Instead of just pressing the equipment key once to fire it, you can now hold it down to charge the Preon for as long as you want. After a bit, it would make a noise, a bit like Huntress's Shine noise from DBD to let you know that it's fully charged. Doing this would make the damage ramp up, but it would also slow you down over time, as you charged it up. I really like this change, as it allows you to choose when and more accurately where you want to fire the ability, which isn't as easy now. Any sort of equipment that allows you to charge it over time is welcome in my eyes, as it allows for more metagaming and strategy, which is usually always a good thing. An item that truly exemplifies a fall from glory is Ben's Raincoat. This item used to be ridiculously overpowered when it was added, but since its nerf, it's kind of pathetic. Yes, cleansing, a debuff, could be useful, but the return of barrier is underwhelming and the cooldown is pretty punishing. Sci-Fi recommends a much more interesting change that instead of giving you a barrier when you cleanse a debuff, it instead boosts your stats for 10 seconds. I love this, and while I don't love the complicated and specific stat changes changes here, it's still a great idea and is specifically designed so that if you had 10 stacks of the item, you would effectively get a Spinal Tonic buff for 10 seconds. If you somehow had a constant supply of debuffs, this could theoretically be really strong, even at low stacks, as sweeping stat buffs are pretty great no matter how you put it. I love this, and the only reason it isn't higher on the list is because this wouldn't be super welcoming for newer players to learn, as I imagine that the in-game description wouldn't tell you these specific statistics, making it a bit awkward. That's a non-issue though, as stat increases still already exist in the game, so let's move on. The Trophy Hunter's Tricorn is a very strong item. Getting a guaranteed boss item is very valuable, so it really doesn't need a buff. However, one thing that is a bit of a letdown about it is how you can't use it on swarms of many and you can't use it on elites. So that's all we'll be changing about it here, making it allow you to get an aspect from elite bosses if you use it on them. Really not much to talk about here. I think the activation system mentioned in the submission could work a little bit better and more seamlessly, but other than that, it's a great change. Everyone knows that the Singularity Band is rarely ever worth it. Unless you have a build specifically tailored towards it, it isn't worth the loss of two of the best green items in the game. Gabe brings up an answer to this issue that I think we've all thought of before. Just make the range increase with further stacks. This would make it so that you can actually get value out of it. On top of that, they recommend a really interesting change, where the damage it deals is based on how many enemies it grabs, increasing by 100% per enemy. I really love this, as it is actually rewarding now to use the item wisely on a group of enemies rather than just one. This is a lot of fun, and while it may not fully replace the Kajaros and Renault's bands still, it would definitely be less bad. Recently, I've been playing a bunch of Seer. One of the most fun ways to play her is to make a self-damage build with her Sojourn ability. This is great and all, but after Sojourn deals a bunch of damage to you, you need to be able to manage surviving and recovering from it. The Red Whip could certainly help with this, however it falls to one major problem. The Red Whip deactivates when you are in combat, which doesn't really help me when I'm trying to escape the enemies. I want to fight back and slow them down, but that slows me down because attacking the enemy deactivates the Red Whip. Sockster has a similar issue with the item and suggests a very simple change. Instead of making it based on if you are in combat or not, it now works more similarly to the Cautious Slug, activating it a bit after you stop taking damage. This is the perfect change to me, as I think the Red Whip would be thrown from an underwhelming background item to a much more interesting and fun to use active item. Brainstalks is an item that falls to the same issue that the Berserker's Pauldron did, being helpful but at the wrong time, as you usually need the buff to kill the elite enemy, not after. The simple change to this is to, instead of putting the buff on a timer, it just removes the cooldown of the next ability you use. This works off of a stacked buff system that allows you to sort of save up charges for your next ability use. Imagine saving up the charges and then spamming 6 Diablo strikes in a teleporter radius. Sure, it could be argued that you can already do that, but this way you wouldn't have to do it immediately. Top 3 reworks are finally here, and the third place is pretty great. A few people suggested this item change because it just makes perfect sense. Every other crit related item increases your crit chance a little bit just to get that little bit more use out of the item. The Predatory Instincts, Harvester's Scythe, and Shatter Spleen all do it, so why doesn't the Laser Scope? This isn't so much of a rework, but a simple buff. Just give the Laser Scope a 5% crit chance buff like all the other items have, because it doesn't really make sense that it doesn't already. Second place isn't really a rework so much as a quality of life change. The Radar Scanner is a helpful item in concept. Unfortunately, when you use it, none of the information it gives you really makes sense. Some of the icons are inaccurate, some interactables are shown as question marks even after you found them before, and overall it's just overwhelming. All we need to change about this is to make the icons actually make sense and be accurate to what they are. Chests show up as chests, different interactables and shrines are made to be unique, drones are shown properly, etc. This item is more confusing than it is helpful, as if you haven't learned what each interactable icon means, it's just too much. And finally, my favorite of the new item reworks is for the Aegis. This change needs no introduction, as it's been one that has been tossed around the community before. Just make the Aegis slow down how fast your barrier decays. Why isn't this a thing? I don't know, but it really should be because this item is pretty trash right now. It's a very interesting item that I feel was just done poorly, so this addition is super welcome. Anyways, that's finally all from me. This video was a lot longer than I expected it to be, but I think it was worth it. I think it's safe to say that we'll reach that goal of 6,000 subscribers by the end of September, so I guess the new goal is 6.5 thousand. That would be really cool, so if you're interested in helping me out there, or if you just enjoy my content, a subscription would be really cool. Be sure to let me know about your ideas for some item reworks in the comments below, and your thoughts on my rankings as well. Thank you to our members who support the channel just that little bit more, and thank you again for watching. Bye-bye.